Hello, I'm Jason Turvey, the middle-aged revolutionary, and welcome back to part two of our YouTube book review of Paul Embry's book, Despised, Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class. And as before, I'm joined again by my friend and comrade, Terry Eaton. Hi, Terry, how are you?
Hi, Jason. I'm
How
fine,
you
mate.
keeping?
Thank you very much.
Good to hear it. So this is part two. Aptly,
Yeah,
we're going to do chapter two this time. So
yes,
the chapter's called "We Need to Talk About Immigration," a juicy topic, and an apt one because obviously a lot of the discussions and a lot of the debates and a lot of a lot of the bollocks talking, frankly, around the general election has been around the issue of immigration. If you were to believe the major parties, there was a constant tidal wave of people on lilos being dragged across the English Channel as we speak,
yep,
morning, noon, and night, and then arriving at Dover and then disappearing to places unknown, never to be seen again. But I
yes,
think the reality is somewhat different. But Paul Embry talks about immigration in the second chapter. I'll just give you a little brief overview about what we're talking about with regard to chapter two. So, in this chapter, Paul Embry talks about what he sees as the hugely disruptive effects of unbridled and uncontrolled immigration on communities, using his home borough of Barking and Dagenham in London as his chief example. So, he begins the chapter by telling us the story of Barking and the decision of the old London County Council to buy a large tract of land to the east of Barking and build 26,000 council houses in what became the Becontree or Beacontree. There's no right way of pronouncing it. I've always called it the Becontree estate,
mm,
which stretches all the way into Dagenham. Embry emphasises the community that developed in this estate, the fact that as he grew up, he knew the vast majorities of the families that lived in his road, and that council estates like Becontree and others were designed with grand aims. And I'm sure you know council estates like this yourself, where you live now. They were
yes,
they were designed with a much bigger idea than housing developments these days, weren't they? I mean, you had basically an entire community built from dust, so it would have parks and churches, police stations, shops, community centres. Um, the houses would usually, especially the ones that were built in the post-war period, very long back gardens because people were still used to growing their own fruit and veg from the
mm,
Second World War. So they were built with a municipal ideal, weren't they? Whereas nowadays, property developers and house builders will take a tract of land and just squash as many houses as possible into it, don't build anything else, and basically leave the amenities that are already there to take the burden of all these extra residents. But just to finish the thought on chapter two, Embry then details the transformation of the borough. That's the borough of Barking and Dagenham. He identifies the running down of the car building in the Ford works at Dagenham being a factor, and details the biggest demographic even change over a 20-year period of any area in Britain. So before we kick off, I mean, as I said, people are talking a lot in the media. It's election time. They're talking about immigration. So, what are your initial thoughts on the debate that's been going on in this country, such as it is on immigration and where we are in terms of immigration in this country?
Well, immigration now, in my opinion, I'll say can be used. I won't say is used, but I'll say can be used as a tool of the ruling class. So they have a continual pool of cheap labour from to undermine, in my opinion, the existing rates of pay, terms and conditions of employment in Britain today. And they do this because um, obviously, if they can bring cheap labour in, this is probably why they would. It was a disaster for them for Brexit because they didn't have them coming in anymore. And I think as we see later in the chapter, we'll just briefly mention it that the less the pool of employees, the higher the rates of pay there has to be. That seems to be the formula when you've got a market flooded, and that's what they've done now. So as you alluded to earlier on, the boat people, as they call them, are a drop in the ocean, to coin
No
a
pun
phrase,
intended.
and no pun intended, absolutely. And compared to the ones that are coming in through the legal, um, you know, from Afghanistan, from wherever that they've had wars, or wherever they're involved in other wars, and Ukraine as well. So they're the ones that are coming in, and I think it's similar to what Embry says here is not too far wrong from what's happening now.
Yeah, I mean it's certainly true. I mean, if we look at, not want to go off topic before we've even started, but one of the things that the collapse of socialism, or the counter-revolution, some might describe it, in Eastern Europe between around about 1989 and 1991, what that created was, for the Western European states, was a huge seam of exploitable labour. And boy, did they exploit it. You know, we have a situation in this country, it may well be shared with our imperialist allies in Western Europe, but we were basically importing ready trained labour from Eastern Europe, and had done for many, many years. It's the reason why this country for decades now has not invested in training in its own staff. It's why it hasn't invested in things like what used to be the old youth training scheme. It's why it hasn't invested in apprenticeships. It's because, for capital in this country, it objects to spending anything for which there is not a handsome return. It does not see employing untrained staff as a good use of its resources. It would far rather import an already trained member of staff and just employ them.
Absolutely.
So not that long ago, we had an issue in our supply line with lorry drivers. We had a shortage of lorry drivers, and there was no answer to it. There was no immediate answer to it, because none of the employers trained people up to HGV level. They expected you to just turn up with a HGV, which meant the onus was on you to either get it in the country that you came from, or if you're from here, you paid for it yourself. That issue with immigration, or sorry, the use of immigrant labour should be the better way to put it. That use of immigrant labour has meant that where there is a labour shortage, the employers are not in the least bit interested in training anyone new. What they want is ready-made people who can start tomorrow. So with that in mind, we'll go into the chapter, and what we're going to do, just to set the scene, and this is something that Paul Embry does at the beginning of the chapter, is he describes the transformation of Barking and Dagenham as a borough. So he sets the scene to begin with, to show how the borough, which was mainly rural up until the 1930s, is going to become this enormous council estate. At one time, I believe, the world's biggest council estate. And the growth of Ford's works at Dagenham, which we'll touch on later. But I'll just read you this. So this is from page 63 of the book. The statistics underline the degree to which the place was transformed so quickly. Between 2001 and 2011, the non-UK born population of Barking and Dagenham increased by 205%. The biggest percentage increase across London during that period, and almost double that of the borough, which saw the second highest increase, which was Greenwich at 103%. During the same period, Barking and Dagenham experienced the highest percentage increase, 169%, of all London boroughs in the non-UK share of all residents. Again, far ahead of the borough with the next highest level, which was Havering. That's my borough at 83%. And then on the top of the opposite page, he writes, forecasts by the Office of National Statistics show that the total population of Barking and Dagenham will rise by 15.4% in the years 2016 to 2026, the third highest percentage increase of all local authorities in England. And these statistics show starkly the enormous demographic change that happened in the Barking and Dagenham borough in the period that he describes. So we go back to 2001. So this book was written in 2021. We're now obviously in 2024. So we're talking about the 20-year period from 2001 to 2021. Now, one of the reasons for people settling in Barking where there's obviously lots of other options in and around London, is because it's got very good transport links, Barking. You are roughly 25 minutes from the City of London. You're close to the A13 trunk road. And for those that don't know the A13, it's a trunk road that basically goes from Tower Hill, where the Tower of London is, all the way east to Southend-on-Sea. In fact, I think it goes all the way to Shoebury. So it's an important trunk road, and it's an easy way to get out of that part of London. But the rise in population in the area has not been matched by a rise in local amenities, and I know this because I was in Barking last week on a personal matter, and it is and has been, and I worked there for 8 years, so I'm not talking about this as someone who's from the outside looking in. I worked in the area for quite a while, and it is an area that's been largely forgotten. You know, it's kind of run down, and it's kind of tired, and it needs quite a lot of regeneration. But I suppose the question I put to you is, Terry, what do you think that sort of demographic change could have on an area over that sort of period of time?
Well, I think it's mentioned in the book. People are, and I don't think, and in some cases, or I'd say the majority of cases, it's got nothing to do with race. I think what it is, it's you got used to your neighbours being the same as you. Your kids went, you went as children, you went to the same schools. Your parents had got a council house. Your grandparents had had a council house on the same estate, probably. And you were right, there was pubs and amenities and surgeries, doctors' surgeries. But with Ford's, I think, with Ford's closing, that was probably the excuse for people to say, well, I've made redundant from Ford's for argument's sake, or as he mentioned, I've sold my council house that I bought on the right to buy, and I'm off because this is not the place I was brought up in. Now, I can't speak. You've been to Barking, I've never been to Barking, but I can't speak on an estate, the demographic change on an estate like that, because I've never seen that happen. It hasn't happened here. There's a few foreign people. There's a couple of Ukrainians. There's Polish people, but they're not, by any stretch of the imagination, the majority in the area I live. So I can only speak as I find. I do remember a good few years ago, I would say in the 80s, I went to a wedding in a place called Basildon in Essex.
Yeah.
And I got talking, and that was like a new town that people had left the East End and went there. And I was talking to a lad, and he said to me, we left not because there was more blacks than us. We were the only white people in the street, and they got a chance to go to a new town, as they called it, and they went. So the area that they left just got took over by immigration and carried on, I suppose, as that. And probably that's what will happen to Barking. But as I say, I can only speak from second-hand information. That's just that lad saying to me, Plaistow he was from.
Yeah.
Have I pronounced it right?
Plaistow, yeah.
Yeah. And that's where he said they'd moved out from. They were just moved out. And so if the council were finding homes in Basildon for white people, they were obviously putting black immigrants in ghettos.
Yes.
Because that's all I can see the reason. Why wouldn't they find a home in Basildon for a black immigrant? So they ghettoised the people some of the people in London.
Yes. Well, we've talked about this before, and I've written about this before on the Class Consciousness Project website, where the ruling class are very, very cynical about how they place immigrants and where immigrants tend to end up because of the way the system is orientated, I suppose. These people who come in from other countries, coming back to the point you were making earlier, people who come to this country from other places almost always come in on an aeroplane with full documentation. They're not illegal immigrants. They're legal. But wherever they're from, and whatever their legality, they're almost always placed in usually poor working class areas, areas that have seen 14 years of austerity, who've seen a lot of their public amenities either run down or gone, who have difficulty in getting onto housing lists, have difficulty finding doctors, have difficulty getting half decent services from their local hospitals and finding school places and all those sorts of things. And I mean, I was thinking about this earlier on. There's not a lot of evidence. In fact, there's very little evidence to connect the issues that people are having finding housing, doctors, school places, and so on with immigration.
No.
But you have to put yourself in the shoes of working class people who've lived there all their lives, where they see these services be run down. They see the difficulties that they get in terms of getting housing, doctors, school places, and so on. And they see the immigration or the demographic of their area change. They see what they perceive as increased immigration to their area, and they put those two things together.
Yeah.
So they then think, oh, we've got immigrants that are coming in, and I'm finding it difficult to get a house. I'm finding it difficult to get a doctor's place. I'm finding it difficult to get a school place, and so on. And it's not difficult. You only have to give people the gentlest of nudges to put those two things together. Would you say that was true?
I think that's absolutely true. But Embry says that he keeps on pointing out that it's nothing to do with race. I think he's being maybe some people that he knows, but I would imagine that a lot of people do say, if it wasn't for the immigrants, we would be able to get a council house or a doctor's appointment. But it's rubbish because if it doesn't matter if somebody moves off this estate where I live and moves somewhere else, and somebody moves in who's not of my race, that doesn't stop me from getting a doctor's appointment. They're the same amount of people living on the same estate who still can't get appointments before the immigrants came in.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not after. So they can't blame immigration why you can't get an appointment. It's the totally cocked up way that they run the freaking system. And they use COVID to disguise what they were doing with regards to doctor surgeries. And just a quick point, and I don't want to go off topic, as you say, Keir Starmer said, and I tweeted to him how, said that he would stop the stampede for appointments at 8 a.m. in the morning. How? I asked him how. When my doctor's surgery, you get if you can get through, they're called caregivers, and they will direct you to somebody who you need to see. My argument is, if you want to see a doctor, there's something wrong with you. You don't go to the doctors for a laugh.
Absolutely.
But our surgery, half the doctors are not there. They're at home, and they're the ones that answer that take the telephone conversations to then say to you, "Oh yes, you need a painkiller." Well, you could have told you that if you'd have been in your doctor's at 10 o'clock in the morning. So that was nothing to do with immigration.
No,
that happened well before any. It's been happening for years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I'll give you a personal story from my life. My wife and I are in separate doctor surgeries. My wife wanted to join mine and was told that she couldn't. She can't join mine. My surgery's closed. She now cannot find. There are 5 surgeries in my town. There are 55,000 people living in that town.
Yeah.
So that works out roughly 1 surgery for every 11,000 people. No wonder you can't get an appointment.
Exactly.
No wonder. No wonder you can't.
That's dead right. And it's not nothing to do with immigrants.
No.
They need an appointment just as well as we. They've got children who get ill. No different from anyone else. And when people say, "Oh, and they do say it, I know they do. They say, "Oh, how will they get appointments and I can't get?" Well, maybe their need was greater. I don't know.
Yeah.
How they work it out.
Yeah.
If you've got a child, I would think that it was a child respiratory was failing or whatever. It seems more urgent to see a doctor than it would for me with a bad foot.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Exactly.
But I still needed to see a doctor.
They're not getting the appointment because they're immigrants. They're getting the appointment possibly because they haven't
because they need it more
doctor than you do.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. It's very, I mean, this is the thing. And again, when you've got to think of this as part of the maelstrom of media coverage, our political class going on about immigration almost every day.
Yes.
You know, you look at the old-fashioned printed media as well. They want working class people to put two and two together and make five, don't they?
Yes,
They
they do.
don't want to say to the working class, the reason you can't get a house is because we've deliberately throttled the supply of houses, which makes it impossible for you to be able to get one.
Yeah.
They don't want that. And
No.
they don't want to say to you, well, we don't want to build council houses because we know the next party that decides to build council houses will basically drop an atom bomb on the entire housing market, which will mean that thousands and possibly hundreds of thousands of people will be destitute, or at least on the way to destitution, because their pension is in those houses that they built up or bought and built up as part of a portfolio. And therein is the problem, isn't it? You know, the answers are not given to the working class by our media and our political class because, well, they daren't tell them that, yeah,
No.
we're deliberately throttling the building supply, so you can't get a home.
They need to have something to blame so that the working class can turn around and say, it's not the fault of my MP. He's all right. It's the fault of immigration, or it's the fault of Brexit.
Yeah.
Oh, that's another one.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
going on and constantly whinging about Brexit. Jesus Christ, it does me head in.
Yeah.
Get
absolutely.
a grip and get, I put up with it from 1975 and accepted it that we lost the referendum to come out. I've put up with it. I haven't whinged constantly every day.
Yeah.
But now I make sure they know when they're whinging.
Oh, yeah. And it's worth reminding them.
Too right.
So the thrust of what Paul Embry was saying in this particular passage of the book is that the demographic was changed wholesale in a period of about 20 years. The population of the area exploded and no one was being listened to in the area. There were lots and lots of concerns about the shortage of housing, the shortage of amenities, including things like school places, like I said earlier, and they felt like they were being abandoned. And so what Paul Embry goes on to on page 65 and 66 of the book is what is a possible and often likely result of working class people being consistently ignored. So I'll quote as follows. And so it was that the local elections in 2006, thousands of voters in Barking and Dagenham, ignored, neglected and scorned, took what they felt was the only action left available to them. They voted for the British National Party and did so in their thousands. 12 BNP councillors were returned, including 2 in the ward, Goresbrook, where I had grown up. Remarkably, the party had stood only 13 candidates out of a possible 51, yet it now formed the official opposition on Barking and Dagenham Council. And I think Paul goes on to say, if they'd stood more candidates, they could have won the council.
Yes, he does.
They could have won the council. So, as we've discussed before, and it's important to remember the year that Paul Embry mentions on page 63 with the statistics, 2001. Now, I believe that was a census year, but it was also significant in the Barking and Dagenham area because that was the last full year that Ford continued to make cars.
Yeah.
They were building Fiestas then, although they weren't the chief builder of Fiestas. I think they were being built in Spain in the main, but cars were still being built at Dagenham. That ended in 2002 and it became a diesel plant, as I said in the last episode. Yeah. So Fiesta manufacture at Ford Dagenham ended in 2002, got converted into a diesel plant. Obviously, car assembly and engine building are 2 different skills. So they would have had to either reskill the people that they had, or more likely let the people that they had go and get other people in to do the work that they needed. So from a 1953 peak, Ford Dagenham employed 40,000 people. And now it employs 2,000 people. And many who left Ford either retired or took their redundancy. In fact, I worked in my employ with more than a few people who used to work at Ford. In fact, I used to work for a few years with a guy who was a foreman at Dagenham. So they left the car industry, and once they left the car industry, it wasn't long after that they left the area entirely. So, in my view, Ember is correct in identifying the sense of abandonment that the people in the area experienced. Their major employer had gone with barely a whimper from the government, and with the demographic changing as starkly and rapidly as it did, and with the people there not being listened to, the area proved fertile ground for extremism, and the BNP took full advantage. Now, it has to be said they didn't put down particularly strong roots to the BNP. They were swept away within a few years. But it's indicative, isn't it, of if you leave a group of people with their major employer gone, with what they feel is no voice, no one listening to them, to the concerns they got about this big employer. And I think it's worth, I know I'm going to hammer this point quite a bit, and I did in the last episode, but it has to be remembered how big an employer Ford was, and how important it was to the economy. And for every place like Dagenham and Ford's, there must be dozens, if not hundreds, of towns and cities across the country that were adversely affected when their main source of employment disappeared. And I'm thinking of places like Sunderland that lost its shipyards and coal pits, and lots of other places all across the length and breadth of the country. It hollows out communities, doesn't it?
Yeah,
when
it does.
the main employer goes. I mean, you worked at BP Castrol, didn't you, in Ellesmere Port? What was the effect of the area when that went?
Well, I worked on for Royal Mail when I'd left there when that went. I left there in '94. They didn't replace people who left, much the same natural wastage they call it, as they do.
Yeah.
But once they're not replacing people in a factory, it'll go down. It wasn't that big an employer. The biggest effect would have happened here would have been Shell shutting half its plant down. It's not even Shell there now, it's SR. And also Vauxhall's and other car plants, massive employer in Ellesmere Port. In fact, when they built Vauxhall's car plant in the 60s, a lot of my friends' fathers came over to actually go on the building of that from Liverpool. And they said to them, local council said, when we finish building this car plant, if you want, you are all entitled to a job in the car plant. And for that to come into the town, we will give you a council house. So they built estates in Ellesmere Port, which basically were full of Scousers. All my mates were basically Scousers, because their dads had come over to build and work at Vauxhall. And that's a simple matter. Now, when that goes, a lot of those people then are they've passed away. But the sons and that, my friends who are now in the 70s, same as me, they all moved off to different places, and they all leave. They sell up and they go. Some go abroad. Some, case of my mate Billy, went to Canada. They don't stay because there's nothing here for them. There's no work. And I think I've mentioned it before, without labouring it, that when I was a young man, if you didn't have a job in Ellesmere Port, you were a lazy get or you were ill, because there was jobs everywhere, and good, well-paying jobs in the chemical industry, and in the car industry, in the oil industry, on the docks, and on the railways. There was everything was here. We didn't have any coal mines. You had to go into North Wales for that.
That's
but
it.
it was built upon that. People in this town all bought well, not all of them, but a lot of people bought their own houses. But some people were happy in the council house that they had, and they either bought it and kept it, or stayed as a council house. I mean, and they're very good council houses compared to some of the boxes you see built, like you said earlier on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a point worth making, isn't it? That council houses, unfortunately, from the 80s onwards, got itself quite a bad reputation. But the truth is, they were extremely well built. They were built to last decades, not 10 years, like new dwellings these days. And yeah, they were much better built, and built to a much higher standard,
definitely,
than modern dwellings these days.
Well, you'll see when you come up, but this estate, the bottom end of the estate was built. Those houses they built after the war, those white houses, the precast ones, and they did away with all that and they reclad them and everything a few years ago. But I actually live on a newer house. No, it was built in the late 40s, early 50s, after the war. But it hasn't fell in.
Yeah.
But some of the houses that they built in blocks of flats, which I worked on the buildings, tenement, not tenements, masonette type flats. They pulled them down. We put them up in 1972 building strike year, and I think they pulled them down in the late 80s, early 90s because they were damp. And it goes back to the RAAC.
Yeah.
Concrete.
Yeah.
Something else we spoke about.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, given the situation that Dagenham found itself in, it only needed a little bit of right-wing agitation, or far right-wing agitation, for a better phrase, to return so many councillors. But of course, the thing is, if you look at the modern left and the liberal left, or whatever you want to call it, instead of understanding the issues that brought those people to turn out and vote for the BNP, they just blamed the voters, didn't they? They called them all racists and bigots, and then what happened after that? And you know, Paul Embry himself might not necessarily like the point I'm going to make here, but the only way that the left managed to challenge racism was by getting them to vote Labour. And you know, as we've said before, there's the Labour's no answer to the issues that beset places like Dagenham.
No,
never was, never will be.
Definitely not.
Never will be.
Before you go on to your next point, there was something regarding that BNP that he wrote that one of the things that I noticed, and he's talking about Dagenham, where the people had left and gone to Clacton-on-Sea, and since then has become known as Little Dagenham.
Yep.
He said, I often think that if such a phenomenon had occurred in affluent middle-class Henley-on-Thames or Guildford or Harrogate, there would have almost certainly have been some kind of inquiry. Questions would have been asked about what was persuading so many local residents to flee their home. But this was Barking and Dagenham, where people were working class and attitudes reactionary, so no one took any notice.
Yeah, and it's absolutely true, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned it earlier about those people that moved from Plaistow to Basildon.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying it's unique to London and Essex. It may well be the case in all the home counties that surround London, but there is a direction of travel for people out from London. So when I was growing up, I grew up in the London borough of Havering, and the vast majority of people, including my mum, were from the East End of London.
Yeah,
and they moved out to the suburbs in the post-war period. My mum was born in Hackney, or she was actually born in Homerton, which is near Hackney. So she moved out with her parents I think it was in the 1950s, and then people who lived in the area that I grew up moved out to places like Chelmsford and Witham and Braintree and Colchester, and then people move even further on still. So it's almost as if the ruling class just presume that this is the natural order of things. You know, people from London eventually slowly migrate outwards.
Oh yeah, yeah. Seems that way.
But he's right. If there was a complete population drop in Cheltenham, the Tories would be scratching their heads wondering what on earth happened. Or if it was in Marlborough, in Wiltshire,
yeah,
where everyone had just up sticks and buggered off because there was nothing left for them there. But he is right. They let Dagenham. No, they let the people of Dagenham, the people who were born there, up sticks and leave, and didn't stop for a second to think why.
No, yeah,
not for a second.
Took no notice because they were working class.
And the interesting thing will be how many of the people that voted for the BNP when they lived in Barking and Dagenham now live in Clacton and have a vote next Thursday, and they got Nigel Farage standing.
Yeah, You're there. Well,
In a way, the ruling class created their own problem, didn't they?
yes. Now, when you put it that way, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, good that.
absolutely. All right, so we'll press on. So there was a very interesting part of the chapter where, and I'll set the scene. So BBC's Question Time broadcast from Barking in 2014. There was a member of the audience called Pam Dumbleton asked a question on immigration and its impact on communities. And when asked to elaborate by David Dimbleby, Dumbleton said that, quote, the government haven't got a clue. David Cameron has never been to Barking. The government need to come and walk through our town and just see how we live. Go back 12 years, it was totally different. And that was her quote. And again, I don't apologize for laboring the point, but 12 years previous to that episode of Question Time in 2014 was 2002 when car production ended at Ford. And it's written again and again through the first two chapters, the seismic effect that the running down of Dagenham, because he didn't stop making cars overnight. It was a long, gradual, tailed off process.
Yeah.
That really begun in, I would say, probably the mid 80s. They built until I think the last full Cortina was built in about 1984, off the top of my head. They then went to the Sierra, and the Sierra was built at Dagenham for a few years, and then production began in places like Germany and Spain.
Yeah.
So as it was from the mid 80s onwards, car production at Dagenham was slowly being ramped down to the point where, like I said earlier on, they only built Fiestas by 2001 and by 2000.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's this point in time, isn't it? This 2001, 2002 period, which is where the demographic change starts, is almost exactly the same time as the Ford car production stopped. And again, it seems to have completely bypassed the ruling class, it's bypassed the modern left. No one seems to understand why these things happen. But without perhaps not knowing it, Mrs. Dumbleton might have hit upon the problem, which was that when car production ended at Ford's works, thousands, if not necessarily thousands, but certainly hundreds of people were made redundant or took severance or took redundancy or whatever was on offer at the time. And then within a few years, I would have thought, had decided to leave and move out further into Essex, perhaps places like Basildon.
Yeah.
So the point I'm getting at, and it's partly why I asked you the question earlier on about BP Castrol, is it can't be overemphasized how devastating the effect on communities can be when major employers close down. You know, we could go to somewhere like Merthyr Tydfil and ask them what happened when the Hoover factory shut down, for instance. Or we could go to, again, coming back to the town or city I mentioned earlier, Sunderland, what effect losing their shipyards and their coal pits had.
Oh, yeah.
And for working class people to have their future held in the hands of private finance, essentially, and private capital in the form of companies like Hoover and Ford, it's incredibly depressing, isn't it?
It is. It is. But that's the same. You could look at the docks in Liverpool. The amount of men that docks employed before containerisation, that was phenomenal. I mean, there was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Rick could tell you better, but I know from people I know, Scousers I know that are my age, that were on the docks, and and it was, but gradually as they dwindling down, they end up not so much moving from Liverpool, but they end up moving out with the jobs, and some ended up coming to jobs in Ellesmere Port.
Yeah,
in the car plant in my factory. There were people from docks and from big industries who'd not down. They'd seen a job and they put in for the job and they got a job because they needed work. And that's the thing. And you have to go further afield for your work. That's what you've got to do.
Yeah, exactly. But of course, obviously, the problem with moving, well, even just from one side of the Mersey to the other, or moving from Dagenham to Clacton, you're initially, if you're the first ones to go, you're going to leave all your support network, all your friends, your neighbours, and then you're moving to a new place, a place you might know. I mean, I dare say most or a lot of people who moved from Dagenham to say Clacton did so because they'd already been there, maybe only on a day trip, but they'd certainly already been there, so they knew what the place was like. But it's still, even in that case, it's still quite an upheaval. And I know this from talking to people many years ago when I lived in Havering in the very eastern edge of Greater London. You feel, even to a small degree, that you were made to go. You were made to leave. Something made you leave. So in the case of Liverpool, it's your job going because the docks changed from crates and stuff to containers. In the case of Dagenham, it's your forward works closed down, and you leave with that tiny little bit of bitterness, don't you?
Oh, well, I would think so.
And it's that bitterness. It's like a seed, isn't it? It grows into something far bigger. And who knows what it will grow into in Clacton next week?
Yes, we'll see, won't we?
We'll see. So we'll stay on the subject of this episode of Question Time.
Yeah.
So at the same, this is on page 70 and the top of page 71. At the same Question Time filming, a male member of the audience chips in support of Miss Dumbleton's point regarding the tumult faced by the local community caused by, amongst other things, immigration. David Arenovich, who writes for The Times, amongst other publications, and was on the panel, attacked him for blaming the wrong people, even though the member of the audience stated that he hadn't blamed immigrants at all and wasn't a racist. And I quote from the book, "Why is a street not yours because some of the faces in it are black?" Arenovich hit back, illustrating that he had completely missed the point. The audience member had never mentioned black faces. Seconds later, the man gave up. He donned his coat and walked off the set. It was an example in microcosm of how the people of places like Barking and Dagenham have been patronised by the liberal and cultural elites to the point of exasperation. Voice concerns about the massive changes to your community and be branded a racist who dislikes black people.
Yeah.
And Arenovich is just one of a plethora of people who personify the attitudes of metropolitan liberal elites, isn't it? They hear the concerns of people who have lived in any given area for years and then dismiss them as racists, even when they don't mention race. And people like Arenovich don't actually care about the reasons for areas like Barking being put into a period of radical change. Again, going back to the Ford Works. Instead, they expect people to accept the changes, embrace the changes as positives automatically, and if they have any objections, just to shut up.
Yes, definitely. That's the attitude that they have. They don't give a shit about the working class. They couldn't care less whether that man was homeless, wasn't he? He couldn't care less. All he wants to put on that show, that Question Time show, was to make a fool of him, or try to make a fool of him, and say, because you said that, you are a racist. And that's the card again.
Yeah.
You are a racist.
Yeah.
And that's what they do all the time. Now, or recently, it's been, you are an anti-Semite, for whatever argument you might have against something else, or you're Islamophobic. There's always a reason why the working class are an ick or an is or whatever it is they brand us. Yeah. And we're none of it. They don't care, because the likes of him, Arenovich, he couldn't give a shit. He'd go drive home in his plush car and he'll drink cocktails after the show when that poor man's go back to his cardboard box.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't necessarily know where Mr. Arenovich lives, but that sort of attitude reminds me of the Islington set in North London, where you got very, very well off middle class liberals living there, diehard Labour voters. You know, some might even call themselves socialists, even though they're not. But their experience of immigration is completely different to the experiences of the people of Barking and Dagenham.
Yeah.
You know, to the people of Barking and Dagenham, the immigrants are their neighbours. They're the people who live across the road. They might even be the people who run the local corner shop. But for the liberal elite, their contact with immigration is the person that served them in the coffee shop, or the person who works in the cheese shop down the road. I haven't got a cheese shop where I live. But their experience of immigration is much more transactional, isn't it? They think, well, a Bulgarian girl served me my flat white this morning, so therefore immigration must be good. And if you don't accept it as being an essential good, you're a racist.
Yes, that's the
And
point.
and the point is as well, and you mentioned it just a moment ago, but I'll reiterate it, is that there is very little, this is a personal view, but I'm willing to stand by it. The modern liberal left can't make an argument to save their lives. It's much easier to pin you with a badge that says you're an obe or an ist, and or a bigot or something like that, and then leave it. It's their way of backing out of the argument. I'm not debating with a racist. I'm not debating with a bigot. I'm not debating with a homophobe and that sort of thing.
What was that thing? Is it in this chapter? I'm trying to think. Where was it? Will Self? Someone
Yes.
said to him, what he said. He made a comment about Brexit people being racists and bigots, and the person said, "Are you going to apologise? Don't you want to apologise for that?" And he said, "What, to racists and bigots?"
Yes.
Now, people watch that show, and then they get in their head, "Oh, anyone?" I mean, I've been called it on Twitter because I advocate Brexit and I stand by it, and I don't care, because I know it's not true. But they use the excuse of people leaving, and I think it's mentioned earlier when you were talking about the Barking and Dagenham with the BP, which is something that I noticed yesterday. The changes many locals in Barking and Dagenham as a consequence of language differences. They could not hold meaningful conversations with their neighbours. It was not a white flight, as they tried to say, but rather a flight to familiarity.
Yes. Yes.
And that rings true to me, that you go where you people that you're the same as, if you're gonna move somewhere, and all your people are moving, so you would get your Basildons and your Clactons and Essex people, Braintree, as you said, and all that.
Yeah.
I see that as quite being,
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like, if you one way to describe it, it's almost like sand going through an hourglass, isn't it? Which is that as people leave an area to settle somewhere else, so the people that they used to know in that area are more likely to follow them in the same direction, to the point where if you're the last man standing, so to speak, how long are you going to stay in an area where all your neighbours and people you would have counted as your friends have gone, but they haven't gone too far up the road. They haven't gone to a place that's unmanageable for you to get to yourself. And so for every person that upsticks and leaves, makes it more likely that you'll go too.
I get that.
And then before you know it, all the community that have been there for many years have gone.
Yes.
And they don't come back.
And that's what we said earlier. That's when the government or the ruling class, they've just set up a ghetto. They've ghettoized the people that have come in.
Yes.
Let's put them, because they're the same, with them. And all them others, will call them racists because they've legged it and gone to live in Basildon.
Yes, that's right.
Just brand them as a bunch of racists.
Yeah.
And that's our argument. We're not arguing with them because they're racist.
Yeah, I'm not debating with an obe or an ist. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's basically it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we'll move on through the chapter now to the bottom of page 74. So after the Leave vote in 2016, evidence emerged, including in the form of a study by the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, showing that a slowdown in the rate of EU workers coming to the UK had contributed to a tighter labour market, which in turn had forced many employers to increase wages. So in capitalism, the movement of labour into and out, whether it be a town, a city, a region or a country, has an effect on the wages workers are able to obtain. Whether it creates an upward or downward pressure, you mentioned that earlier. It's simply supply and demand. It's that dynamic, isn't it? And this is why capitalism creates what Marx called the reserve army of labour, a pool of unemployed people used as a mechanism to depress wages. Now, I listened to Comrade Alex's broadcast a couple of days ago on immigration, and he made
Yeah.
a very good point, which is that immigration in and of itself has not been used as a tool to depress wages. What was used as a tool to depress wages was action by the government, including the anti-trade union laws that came in, the bulk of which came in 1992, which enshrined in law banning things like secondary action and so on. So we've had action by the government going all the way back to when Thatcher was elected in 1979 to push down wages.
Yeah.
Now, it could be argued, and this is not necessarily my opinion, but it could be argued that immigration's being used to hold down wages, not necessarily further depress them, but hold them down. Because as Alex said in his podcast, or in his live stream, sorry, he said the long and the short of it is that immigrant workers are doing the same jobs as indigenous people, for want of a better word, native people, for the same crap money. They're not earning less than people from here. They're just earning the same money as people from here. But the long and the short of it is that since the 90s, since the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, governments of both colours have exploited Eastern European labour, for instance, haven't they? You know, they emigrated from the former socialist countries to Britain, worked on poor wages, and was cynically used by the government to create a downward pressure. So not necessarily push wages down, but create a pressure that held them down.
Mm.
So, you know, it's very cynical of the ruling class. And the long and the short of it is this: it doesn't matter really who is elected on the 4th of July as either a minority government or a majority government. It doesn't matter whether it's Labour or Reform or the Tories. It doesn't matter. They won't be able to stop immigration. They won't be able to stop immigration because capital demands immigration.
Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah.
And I don't even think they say, you know, we're stopping the boats. But they've got people fixated now. And Farage is as bad. Is saying they're coming over, as you said earlier, on lilos and rubber tires. You know, there's not millions of them. There's the illegal immigrants. So I'm making a big deal about we're going to put them on planes and send them to Africa. Well, why would the Africans want a load of people that have been sent from another land? Sort them out here.
Yeah.
That's the answer.
Yeah.
Stand up and say, you know, let's get but don't lie to the people and say the reason that, you know, knife crimes increased, child molestation and rape of women is all blamed on foreigners.
Yeah.
But raping women and child molestation has been going on since I was a kid, and there wasn't many foreigners here then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
That's just it's just to find something to blame to save them from having to solve the problem, in my view.
Yeah. And
I agree with Embry on that. He seems to, you know, he sort of hankers on that sort of thing. But yeah, you're right.
It's very, very easy, isn't it? And it's something that I'm sure lots of people have slipped into from time to time, is to slip into the easiest option, which is to blame the people themselves, not the system that creates the problem in the first place, isn't it?
That's it.
You know, blaming immigrants for being immigrants is wholly unfair, isn't it? I mean, it's something we haven't touched on yet, but we do have to look at it. Why did we create the collapse of the Libyan state? Why did we create the quagmire that's occurred in Syria? Why did we illegally invade Iraq and Afghanistan and create refugee crises every single time? You know, if you look in America's a very good example. They have a similar problem in terms of a very long and protracted debate, and it's coming from both sides of the political spectrum on immigration. But then you look at America's imposed brutal sanctions on Venezuela. And then in 2021, Joe Biden gave Venezuelan immigrants preferred immigrant status, which meant if they made a claim for asylum, or if they made a claim for migration to the United States, they would get priority over any and all other immigrants.
On that point, sorry, were you going to go on then?
No. It's all right.
On
That
that
really was
point,
my
it's just
point.
something I've been watching on. They have these um, congressional committees, and there's a few of them on. And I know it's they rattle the sabers and all this capable. There's a point of saying to Biden, but it's not just his government that have done it; it's other governments as well about the border between Mexico and the Rio Grande. And they're saying, you just swim over the border and then uh, get yourself at a post and then walk through, and you're then in America. But they're talking about it with the extent to Chinese people as well, being flooded with Chinese people. Well, how did they get in? They didn't swim. So did they all go to Mexico and then try and get across the border
All
from
caught planes to Mexico City and then trudged up through the border. I
swam the
mean,
Rio Grande?
exactly. The point in America is largely the point here. They're not piling over the border from Mexico. They're landing on planes
Yeah,
with full paperwork.
yeah. I know.
And they're doing that because American capitalism, like British capitalism, demands it.
Correct.
It demands it. You know,
And it
one of
can't do
the
without it.
one of the key issues for the ruling class in most of the West, and including its satellites like South Korea, is that we're not replacing ourselves quick enough. I think the average number of births per woman in this country is now 1.2.
Mm.
That's not replacement rate. And so capital needs to find another way. If essentially, if you're not going to replace yourselves, we'll have to replace you ourselves. And that's how they do it. They do it by
Yeah.
importing
And
cheap labour.
if you were cynical like probably me and you, we would say, well, the two child benefit cap, that doesn't help people wanting bigger families. And also, they don't make it easy to bring up children because everything's so dear. So
Yeah.
people are turning around saying, well, I'm not having children until I've got myself a career. So there'll be couples who may live together, they may get married. They're not like when I was growing up, or my parents, that you married, and within a couple of years, you had children, and that seemed to be the done thing.
Yeah.
They were
Yeah.
all young families. They were my father and mother were both the same age.
Mm.
So they were born in 1927 and I was born in 1953. So
Yeah.
they're only in the 20s and I'm born. Now you'd get people who are in the 40s
Yes.
and and like
Yes.
you say, that's a change. Didn't China have to change the one child policy, or is that Japan? Am I getting
It was
confused?
China.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they realized that we weren't reproducing ourselves,
Yes.
as Marx says
Yeah.
in
Absolutely.
Wage, Labour
And
and Capital, I think.
yeah, what you're saying about having children younger, it used to be an accepted truth that when a couple had children, it was always better to have them earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Because doctors used to advise against women getting pregnant over the age of 35.
Mm.
You know, when I was born, I'm the eldest of four. When I was born in 1973, my mum was in hospital for a week
Yeah.
because that's what happened. You were in
Yes.
hospital for a week. Now you're home in the afternoon, but I'm going off the topic a little bit there. But the point I was going to make was that it was considered um, advantageous to have children younger because the prevailing theory was, well, if you're younger, you can keep up with your kids more. If you're having your kids when you're 40, they're in their mid-50s, or you're in your mid-50s by the time
Yes.
they're reaching school age. You're clapped out by then.
You can bring them up.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, my sons, I was actually I was the same age as Tony Blair when Tony Blair had his son Leo, I think.
Right.
That's not a claim to fame to be equal to Tony Blair, I might add. That's about the only thing we've got in fucking common. But and so Lewis is 24 and I'm 71. So do the maths. But the thing is, that's because I met my second wife and she's 10 years younger than me. But in when I was younger, people had children because they could afford to have one wage earner.
Yeah.
And not have to both go out to work. And the expense of putting the child in a nursery, which is colossal. I mean, it's probably more, you could probably have an operation done on private than have your child looked after by a nursery for a week. It's scandalous.
Yeah.
Of course, they pay you benefits if you've got a, say, autistic or anything like that child, but which is fair enough. They've got to go in to be taught, but um, it's not. It doesn't allow the person to go out and get a full-time job, and especially if the single parents.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a
And the
lot
other,
of that. That's a
yeah,
lot. That's a lot of people.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other thing I was going to say was that even if a government of any colour came into power next week, wanted to increase the birth rate, the only real tool they've got is money, isn't it?
Yeah,
Is to throw money at people, either be by giving them um, tax breaks, or actually just giving them straight cash, or giving them discounts, or whatever. But that's really it. Once you go beyond cash, the government's all out of ideas. It doesn't really have a lot of tools available to it to motivate people to have more children. Um, and you know, I've written before on the phenomenon of dinks, dual income, no kids. You know, people who are deciding from the outset that they're just not going to have children for all kinds of reasons, and it is a real problem. And it's a problem. I'll touch on it later on regarding another country later on, but I'll just plow back into the book if I may.
yes,
We go to the bottom of page 75. Um, so just by way of a small introduction, he's talking about controls on immigration. He's talking about the what he sees as the net benefit, at least in the short term, of cutting immigration on wages. And then he takes a swipe at the trade unions when he says the moral bankruptcy of the trade union leaders on this subject, immigration, borders on the criminal. Their role in life is to secure for their members the most favourable wages and conditions. But where that objective conflicted with their own personal ideology, in this case, their support for open borders, they put ideology first. For many of them, maintaining the purity of their own worldview was given primacy over the interests of their members. And speaking to someone who was a national officer for a trade union for 6 years on an executive committee for a total of 9, that's 100% correct.
yeah,
100% correct. The arguments that I had with senior trade union officials regarding open borders was, well, if I had a penny for every argument, I'd be quite a lot wealthier than I am now. But no, I can't make an argument against what Paul Embry said there. One point for discussion, I suppose, is the influence of Trotskyism on the upper levels of the trade union movement, because it is a well-known Trotskyite strategy, isn't it? It's not about, they don't want to actually talk to the members of trade unions at the grassroots. No. It's about getting one of their own on an executive, isn't it?
yeah,
That's what they're all about. That's their first priority, isn't it?
yeah. They don't go for the grassroots, as you say. They don't, because those people, they've got their heads screwed on regarding trade unions. It's when they get higher up, and we've said it before. And as you say, we can labour on the point, but trade union leaders, and once you get to full time and on, and I'm not saying the lay member who gets elected by being a shop steward onto an executive, he would be banging his head against the wall doing what you've tried to do, and he'd be the same as you. And then you think, well, what's the point?
Mm.
Because I might as well just look after me lads back. No point coming here to this. But some of them do have delusions that they're going to go on and become,
Yeah,
a
of
full
course.
time official and all that. So there is that. Yeah, but
But
I
yeah,
can't. I think
it's
Embry's correct on that.
yeah,
Trade union.
I do as well. I
I
can't
think
really
it's
make an
a
argument
good
against
word.
it.
Moral bankruptcies as good as anything I would think of.
Yes.
Say about trade union leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's a point that we make over and over again, and I sound like a broken record, but it's just another demonstration, another example of how completely disconnected the upper layer of the trade union movement is from the people at the bottom, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah,
it was, there's always been a gap, but it's a chasm now, isn't it? You know,
absolutely. And
there's such a gap between the top and the bottoms of trade unions. It's almost unbridgeable now.
oh, that's it. I mean, yes, definitely. It was bad enough with full time officials when I was a branch secretary, and that was in the 70s and 80s. I don't know what it must be like now for a lay official.
Mm.
And it'd be better, as I've said before. We can carry on and carry on, but the grassroots of the union, I would recommend people join a union. But once you get past the lay officials onto the full time officers, then you're just wasting your time because they're all careerists.
Yeah.
And when the career's finished at 60 in the transport, well, unite, then give me age away then. Instead of transport in unite, then they'll just jump for a role maybe in the Labour Party in the
Yeah,
local if they've
exactly.
got a seat coming up,
Yeah.
or a little sideways move into the House of Lords if you've been a leader.
Well,
I'm
yeah.
convinced, I'm convinced, that some of these people they say and do these things because they want to be put in there, and there's nothing we can do about it. But so it's right that you keep hammering the point. And when
Yeah.
we say in this discussion about trade union leaders, people look at this and they go, "Oh, they're anti-union." No, I'm not anti-union, neither are you, because we've grown up with unions. What we're anti is shite trade union leaders
Yes. Yes.
taking
Absolutely.
the under
I,
false pretenses.
I've been a member of a trade union since I was 16 years old, and I only dropped out of the movement at the end of last year.
Hmm.
I would encourage anyone, anywhere, in any walk of life, to join a trade union if there's one that's available to them. And I have to
Yeah,
be
definitely.
fair, there's not necessarily a trade union for you, depending on what sort of industry you're in. But if I slag off a trade union leader, or if I slag off a trade union, I'm not slagging off its members.
No,
I'm slagging off the leaders.
exactly.
And it's important to make that distinction because they are not the same. In 2024, trade unions are led by its leaders. It should be led by its members, but it isn't. And that's the
Yeah,
reality of it. And if I call that out, I'm not anti-trade union. I'm anti-trade union leadership.
correct. Absolutely.
So with that, I'll move on. So we'll go to the bottom of page 84, top of 85. Evidence shows that most people in Britain are supportive of some form of immigration, but merely want it controlled to the degree that it doesn't cause sudden or profound social or economic disruption. For example, a YouGov poll conducted in 2018 showed a complex picture, with 24% agreeing that levels of immigration over the previous decade have been mostly good for the UK, 32% mostly bad, and the largest group at 35% believing it had been both good and bad. However, when asked their opinion on whether or not the level of immigration during that decade had been too high or too low, a clearer divide emerged, with 63% agreeing it had been too high, 22% believing it had been about right, and only 4% holding the view that it had been too low. So, for me, the poll's findings marry up with the views of people that I've spoken to on the matter over the last 10 or so years, which is that most people generally are not opposed to immigration as a thing.
Hmm.
You know, we've got a long colonial past. We've called on the former empire to help us out with labour shortages going back decades. You know, it's a fact of life. It's what happens. We can debate the rights and wrongs of it perhaps at another time and another place, but that's the fact of the matter. You know, we've called on the former empire when we've had labour shortages.
Absolutely.
So it's
Yeah.
arguable that many people may not fully understand the ruling class's motivations for importing workers, which we've talked about already, but they understand that they did, and that the British culture has been enriched by that immigration. But the 2024 version of the ruling class are far more cynical than their forebears. They know that in order that British capitalism continues to create profit, it needs ever more hyper exploitable workers. And this is exacerbated by the low number of births per woman in this country, as I said. So the
Hmm.
most hyper exploitable workers are those that have arrived illegally because they're a deportable source of labour. And in summary, most objections to immigration relate to controls of it rather than immigration
Yeah,
itself.
I agree with that.
And so, from the ruling class's point of view, the best immigrant worker is an illegal one, isn't it? Because if you could hang over them, you step out of line, I'll
And you're
deport
off.
you.
Yes.
That's a greater amount of control that you could have over any other worker, legal or otherwise. That to say to that person, you step out of line, you're out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when they're being paid terrible wages, working in terrible conditions, doing awful, unrewarding, drudgery work, they're not going to complain. They're not going to unionize. They're not going to collectivize. They might not even talk to their colleagues about how bad things are. They'll just get on with it. And that's exactly what the ruling class want, isn't it?
Yes, of course they do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll move on because this is an interesting point. And it's the last point I've got from this chapter before we wash up. Bottom of page 87, top of 88. In the eyes of many of our liberal politicians and commentators, it seems that a nation cannot be considered civilized if it exercises strict control over its borders or in any way encourages a national culture and recognizes the desire of its citizens to feel part of it. By extension, it is assumed that any perception felt by those citizens that their culture might be in some way under threat can originate from an innate xenophobia or racism. But you only need look at a country such as Japan to see that this isn't the case. A highly civilized, advanced democracy, Japan maintains rigid border controls or rigid control over immigration, not by closing its borders completely, but simply by ensuring that numbers are modest and manageable, while fostering a deep and abiding sense of patriotism and belonging amongst its people. Now, I have this Financial Times from the 13th of April. Okay. If you don't read the FT, you should read it at least a couple of times a week. It's not cheap, but it's worth it because you get a good couple of days worth of reading out of it. Now, they published an article on the 13th of April, which said that Japan has hit the same fertility crisis as the rest of the developed countries. And I'll quote from the FT article as follows. According to official data released yesterday, that'd be the 12th of April, the number of Japanese nationals dropped by the most annually since comparable records began in 1950, a fall of 837,000 in the 12 months to October 2023. That decline represents a daily drop of 2,293 people, or 96 people an hour. Japan's overall population was 124.3 million, down 595,000 from the previous year, when adjusted for rising levels of migrant workers, overseas students, and foreign permanent residents. Japan's population has been in decline for 13 consecutive years, and the age demographic of the nation is top-heavy. The percentage of the population over 65 years old stands at 29.3%, while the percentage of people aged under 15 years is just 11.4%. Birth rates are also declining, with a record low of 758,631 born in 2023, down 5.1% on the previous year. The Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, has said that the crisis has taken the nation to, quote, the brink of being unable to maintain social functions. Japan released a package of incentives aimed at increasing the birth rate, including reducing medical education and other costs. But if the short-term crisis of the steep decline in the population becomes a medium to long-term one, Japan will face a real social and economic crisis, which it will not be able to solve without importing cheap and hyper-exploitable labour from neighbouring states. So it looks like what Paul Embry said about Japan has been disproved 3 years later by a steadily declining population and a top-heavy population. So the majority of the people in the country are from the over 65 age bracket. And even the Prime Minister himself saying, if we don't do something, things are going to get pretty bad, to use an English phrase as opposed to a Japanese one. So, Terry, what were your reflections on what's going on in Japan and how that sort of compares to the situation in Western Europe, for instance?
Well, I should imagine. I see. I didn't know this about Japan. I mean, I was looking at what he said, but now you've pointed that out. That's a lot of people and a lot of a reduction. I mean, where are all these people going for one thing? But it's the birth rate.
Yeah.
That's the thing, like you said, 1.4 children, 1.5 children. Now, obviously, they would probably put in a cap of 2 children at the same. But if they're not having them because of the same as here, the cost of living or whatever other reason, I don't know how the financial wages that work out with in Japan, whether they're greater or whether two can work or one can work and live in a family. But if if that's probably the same as people leaving here, but people aren't leaving here as often or as many as they used to, are they, Britain?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if they're leaving in those numbers for 13 consecutive years on the age demographic of the nation is top heavy, well, that's what makes me so cynical about when they look at the age demographics, because our age demographic will be top heavy. And so they tried to kill us all off with COVID. But that's me being cynical to think, well, if we get rid of all these old ones, then there's more to go around because we're non-productive, right, to them.
Yes,
we don't earn,
yes.
you
Yeah,
don't
we've
go
got
out.
we've got to stress we're talking from the view of the ruling class here, who are incredibly
Well,
awful and incredibly
well,
cynical and incredibly evil. Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely.
But
I mean,
I'm not
I was
saying
going
that
to say
I'm
just
not useful.
no, exactly. But to answer your point about where the 595,000 people have gone, the clue is in the age demographic of the population. Almost 30% are over 65. They died. They died and they've not been replaced. So they've got themselves a problem now where they've got almost a third of the entire population of Japan, which is 124 million at the last count. Almost a third are over 65. A third. So
Yeah.
as you said, and we when we say non-productive, we're not being nasty, we're not being derogatory, we're not being
We aren't. You're
no,
right. We're
no,
saying what
but
they would call us.
yes, we're talking about a percentage of the population, the majority of which don't work. Okay, so they're retired. So they are drawing on pensions and are not working. Okay,
Yeah.
so they're not putting as much back into the system. They put a lot in the system in their working lives. They're in their retirements. The problem is, as these people die off, they're not being replaced. And so Japan, who had controls on immigration, as Paul Embry wrote, managed to protect their culture. I do happen to think, though, one of the issues that helps protect the culture, so to speak, is the fact that Japanese is not a widely spoken language outside of Japan. It's not something that people in Britain or the United States can, or even Canada or Australia, New Zealand or so on, because we speak English. And it is something that does attract immigrants to those countries, isn't it? The fact that they can go there and speak English.
Yeah.
Because English is essentially the second language, because Britain demanded it for many, many years, and then the Americans after us. So one of the reasons why there possibly hasn't been mass immigration into Japan is because it is one of the perhaps 3 countries you could argue you're not going to get by without learning the language.
Yeah.
The other 2 I would say would be Britain and Russia. Probably 2 other countries that you need to learn at least a bit of the native language before you make your trip. Otherwise, you might find yourself struggling. But we're at a point now in 2024, 3 years after Paul wrote these words about Japan, where Japan's staring down the barrel of a gun, just like the entire Western Bloc is, isn't it? Where we're not replacing ourselves, and now we need to find labour from somewhere else. The question for Japan is where they're going to find it from.
Yeah, it's not somewhere on your list. Language aside, it's not somewhere on a list of a person who's thinking that they're going to emigrate. Oh, I know. I think I'll emigrate to Japan. Well, you're going to go to Canada or to Australia, or as you say, it's the same language. I don't. I know one of our colleagues, Joe Moss, lived in Japan for a while. He might tell you some information about Japan when he was there.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to
Yeah.
You certainly couldn't go like you could to most European countries, not being able to speak a word of the lingo and get by with English.
Yeah.
You know,
broken
you might come up
Spanish or
against a few
whatever.
places and a few specific. I mean, you know, a fairly obvious example, but you know, go to the southern part of Portugal. you don't need to speak Portuguese at all.
Hmm.
Everyone speaks English down there because there's so many British tourists there. And you know, places like the Netherlands as well. You know, you can,
Yeah.
you know, English is spoken. They
Well,
learn English, I believe, from
in
5. So you know,
in Cuba, if you're walking around and children, well, maybe not now so much, not the last time I went, but when I first went, children would come out and ask you for stuff, you know, and they'd ask you where you were from, and you'd say, England, Great Britain, English, yeah. And one of their crew would be able to speak English. If you'd have said French, it'd be a different one.
yeah,
And I had a great evening with a young couple. She was heavily pregnant. She wanted to go to, this is an aside, I know,
yeah,
but she wanted to go to America. And he said, there's no way my child's being born in America, but she could speak French and he couldn't speak English. And the only way I could communicate was talking to her in schoolboy French so she could translate it to him in Spanish. Because I don't speak Spanish, but I can speak a little bit of French
right,
to get by, to get by. And it was interesting, but that you say this, and it's not because they learn because they know tourism's important. Now, Japan, probably I would say people in Japan, businessmen would probably learn English because it's a universal language, isn't it?
yes,
But as regards us learning theirs, no, I don't think so.
no, no, exactly. And the challenge for Japan in the coming years is to redress this problem,
Mm.
because it's conceivable that that percentage of people over the age of 65 will only go up, not down, and that the age of, or the percentage of people under the age of 15 will only go down and not up. So they actually, maybe not in the short to medium term, but certainly in the long term, they face a real crisis.
Yeah, they do.
They will
Looking at
have an
those
aging
figures,
population leaving work, going into retirement, and no one coming in behind them. Their jobs that they did will disappear because there will be no one there to backfill, unless, again, and I'll put the point again, unless they go to a system not dissimilar to the one here, United States and Western Europe, where they import labour from elsewhere.
mm. Yeah, yeah.
It'd be interesting to watch. So we'll close on that particular point. Um, let's sum up. What did you think of that particular chapter and Paul Embry's arguments regarding immigration?
I can't, to be honest with you, I can't find a lot to fault what he says about it when you on the surface. We can delve and look into it. But there was a point that I found. Um, I thought I'd leave it till the end. It's on page 69, and it's just referring to my notes. It's just the people were told basically. Maybe this part isn't, but it's just what I'm going. People were told to embrace a new and vibrant multiculturalism in a diverse modern Britain. It was not difficult to see. I don't think that is on 69. Second para, 69.
Is that the one that begins, in this context it isn't difficult to see?
Yeah, basically, I've just paraphrased it, haven't I?
Yeah,
Yeah, politically. But I'm just saying that it was it was not difficult to see, given the circumstances, that this did not resonate with those people, what
yes,
they wanted. So you're saying it is not the fault, my view, it's not the fault of how this attitude, it was not the fault of these people. It was this attitude by an uncaring government
yes,
that led to the arrival of the BNP in the beginning, which we spoke before,
yes, yeah,
which we, as I say, mentioned earlier. But all the above that we've said, and all this about the BNP and Barclays, he's not saying, and I'm agreeing with him, that it's not right or wrong, but he's saying it's just as it is or as it was. It's not the fault of the people. The judgment is to be passed, in my opinion, is on the government and the local officials. There's no other
yeah,
person to blame.
no,
Those people aren't racist, so therefore they're not blaming immigrants. So who to blame for this change in demographics?
yeah,
And it's got to be governments and the local officials, and that's the point people need to be made aware all the time. It's not the fault of those people; it's the fault. If you're in an area like this, I'm not, but if you're in an area where it's been mass, mass immigration like that,
Yeah.
it's a choice made by governments, by the ruling class,
Yeah,
via
absolutely. Yeah.
via their kowtowing governments, Tory or Labour. It doesn't matter.
Yes. Yes. And it's important to make that point, Terry, isn't it? Is that both the Tories and the Labour Party are to blame. They put different veneers on their approach to immigration, but they're both equally cynical.
Yeah.
They are both parties of capital. So they will act in the interest of capital, and capital demands immigration.
Yeah.
That's the equation. There's no other way of putting it. And, you could do tricks with optics and make it look slightly different if you're the Labour Party as opposed to the Tories. But the long and the short is that's the fact of the matter is capital demands it. Therefore, it will happen.
And
the thing to be just to close the thought, what one has to remind themselves of when they read this particular chapter is that Paul Embry is a social democrat. So he believes that capitalism can somehow be bent to the will of the people, if you like. I don't necessarily agree with that particular view. I don't believe that capitalism can be anything other than what it is. But in a capitalist context, because the movement of the labour force is a market dynamic, there has to be some sort of control on immigration. The question is, how much of a control? And that then speaks to the point that people were making in that survey, where they said they didn't have an issue with immigration as a thing; they had a problem with the levels of them.
Yes.
And that's the critical thing. Now, of course, if there was a pan-continent socialist revolution, all these questions about immigration would disappear. But we're not there. We're not there. But until we're there, these are the realities that we're having to deal with.
We are.
But it was again an enjoyable chapter to read, very thought-provoking, and I'm looking forward to reading the next chapter, which leads us into what I'm about to say now, which is that chapter 3 in our next episode will be a new national religion, liberal wokedom, which I can't wait to get my teeth into.
Happy days.
Happy days indeed. So, just to remind you, Paul Embry's book, Despised, Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class, available at all good bookshops, published by Polity Books. Again, I don't necessarily agree with all the points made within the book, but it is a good read, and I encourage you to buy it or borrow it or read it. But there it is, and do have a read. It's a very good book. But for now, Terry, I'm going to say good night.
Thanks good night to you, Jason.
And we'll see you next time.
You definitely will, mate.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Good night.